Welcome, excuse me, welcome to this special edition of the Georgia Hour with BKP on voiceofruralamerica.com. This is a special segment that we're doing today, this Friday, January 24th, 2025, on the Georgia Hour. Now, we presented a segment maybe a little over a week ago concerning HB581. And before I bring my guest in here, in November, Georgia voters had some constitutional amendments on their ballot when they went to vote. And they had a constitutional question or change on the ballot. Proposition 1, HB 581, dealt with property tax appraisals. Now, in general, there's a lot of people have been very concerned with their taxes going up on property tax, appraisals going up enormously in the past several years. And lawmakers last year put a question on the ballot that said HB 581 that dealt with appraisals and capping property tax assessments. That being said, it was voted in 60-some percent. I mean, like 65% of Georgians voted yes on this proposal. Many counties voted 60 to 75% yes on the proposal, on the constitutional amendment. Let me get that clear. But there is an option for cities, municipalities in Georgia, counties, and the Board of Education to opt out. All right. Now, that being said, there are town hall meetings all across the state that where the county, the cities, and Board of Education are holding for citizens to come and address this opting out. Since we had State Senator from the 51st District, Steve Gooch, on last time, he's the state Republican majority leader in the Senate. Since that, I went to a public hearing in Fannin County, and I listened to the Board of Education and the commissioners and some of the city council members and some citizens. And there's a lot of confusion around this. So I asked yesterday. I read an article in the Rome newspaper that was published, a guest article from the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, State Senator from the 52nd District, Chuck Hufstedler. And so we're going to bring in State Senator Steve Gooch and State Senator Chuck Hufstedler, if they're both available. And we're going to try to clear up the confusion on HB 581. Are they available, Diane? Do we have both of them ready? Okay, I have State Senator Steve Gooch. I got a message. Good morning, Senator. I got a message that he was trying to sign in, Diane. Did you get that? It said logged in and waiting. Did you get that message that the state senator?
I see he's trying to go in, but he doesn't have his camera working yet.
Okay, so we're waiting on him to come in. Hold on just a minute.
BKP, tell him not to worry about the camera. He's not that good looking anyway.
All right. So, Diane, if he's available, it comes in. We got to take advantage of the time we have, and we know State Senator Steve Gooch has a top of the hour meeting when we discussed this yesterday. So if he becomes available, let's just bring him in and we'll introduce him. Folks, joining us now from the 51st District, the majority leader in State Senate, Steve Gooch. Good morning, Senator. How are you?
Hey, good morning. I'm doing well. I'm driving up Georgia 400, but I have my hands on the wheel. But it's good to be with you.
Okay. All right. So from the last time we talked, I went to a town hall meeting and I listened, and I'm going to give you a couple of the things that came out, and then some of the confusion. And I will say that I think some of the confusion, in my words, is being created. That's my comment. Let me ask you a question as far as HB581, the Senate last year.
Yes.
When you passed it out of the Senate, just for some clarification here of the opt-out, when you passed it out of the Senate, did it go to the House with an opt-out option? And what was that vote like from the Georgia State Senate?
The opt-out version came from the House. When we passed it out of the Senate, it was a clean bill that gave no opt-out by the locals. I think when it came out of the Senate, the local government associations that you talked about so much this week, ACCG, GMA, and then of course the Georgia School Board Association, they all started to get into what I call the panic mode. They don't like these kinds of bills because it limits their ability to raise revenues. And so they started to push back and fight the House on the bill, trying to kill it. The House knew they could not kill this bill. They had to pass it because it was good for taxpayers and for homeowners. So they compromised with these local government entities to put this opt-out language in the bill. And the House members told us in the Senate that was the only way they could get the votes to pass it out of the House. So they sent it back to us with that language in it, which I think was, now looking back, is a big mistake, because almost 2/3 of the school boards around the state are having these hearings. They haven't all decided yet to opt out, but it looks like they're leaning that direction.
All right. So now it left the Senate, went over to the House. It did not have an opt-out clause in the bill. These are my words. So the Georgia School Board Association, the Georgia Municipal Association, and ACCG, the Association of County Commissioners of Georgia, they lobbied the House, my words, they lobbied the House to get an opt-out clause in this. So that's basically where that came from, the House, and the only way you could get it passed is when it came back is with the opt-out. Now, why do they want to opt out? Let's make that simple. And why? We have counties, we have cities, we'll get into that, but why so many school districts want to opt out of this? What's your thought?
Personally, I think if you go back, and I made this statement on your show last week, I would encourage everybody that's listening to us today to go get your tax bill from your drawer, wherever you keep your records. If you don't keep your past years of tax records, go to the courthouse, go online to your county tax commissioner's office, and pull up about 7 to 10 years of your property tax bill on your home, and just look at how fast these tax increases have gone up. And a lot of the counties, cities, or school boards around the state have done it in a clever way. They've kept the millage rate the same, so they wouldn't get blamed for raising taxes by raising the millage rate. But instead, they did what we consider a backdoor tax increase. Anytime you reassess properties in the county, and if you don't lower that millage rate by the same amount that the increase in values have gone up, then you're essentially raising people's taxes. And so these local governments fear raising the millage rate, because local taxpayers are always looking to see if you've raised the millage rate. Instead, they keep the millage rate the same. In some of these counties, we've seen 15, 20, 30, even 40% tax increases, because the values of these homes have gone up so rapidly since 2021 or 22. And so they fear losing that ability to raise all that significant revenue. This bill does not lower their revenue that they're currently collecting. That is another one of those scare tactics that they're putting out. They're saying, oh, we can't operate the school, we can't make payroll, we can't operate park and rec, we can't keep our roads and bridges up because this bill is going to hinder us from being able to collect the money that we need to maintain local services. That's not true. What this bill does is it keeps the inflated increases from going up more than the previous year's CPI, which is still 5, 6, 7%. In the last 2 years, we've seen CPIs as high as 8 and 10%. If a local school board tells you that they need more than a 10% increase in revenues, something's wrong in the way they manage their budgets.
All right. So, I was going to have another state senator on here, and not to get you brought it up, but not to get you to answer for it. He wrote an op-ed piece in the Rome paper, Chuck Hofstadler, that I read, and it says scare tactics fuel opt-out argument. Let me tell you some of the things that when you get into these counties, we're getting things much like, and they start discussing things, and no disrespect to the citizens, but they get a little confusing. They want to start discussing the home rule, and they'll lose the home rule, and floating exemptions, and their exemptions they already have in place. What is some clarification in that confusion that you have heard from taxpayers? Can you clear up when they start talking about, well, we don't want to lose home rule, and we already have floating exemptions and things of that nature? Can you address that?
Sure. First of all, any county, city, or school board that currently has an exemption on the books for any citizen, those citizens will continue to collect that exemption. This bill does nothing to that. In fact, if the exemption is not as good as what this new rule would give the taxpayer, then whichever benefits the taxpayer the most will then go to that taxpayer. So if any school board member or any local government member tells you that this is going to somehow impact what you're currently going to get, that is not true at all. This is in addition to that. This is basically a protection plan to prevent tax assessors' offices from reassessing your home for a greater value than what the previous year's inflation was for our state. And that's all it does. It's very clear. It does not stop them from collecting revenues. School boards, counties, and cities can still maintain local control by setting the millage rate like they have done forever in this state for 200 years. They will continue to raise the millage rate if they have to raise the millage rate to balance their budgets, or they can cut expenses. If they don't have enough money to run their systems, they have two choices, Brian. They can cut expenses, or they can adjust their millage rate to make sure the revenues are there to meet their needs for their community.
Okay. What I heard the other night and is being reported in some publications is some citizens said, well, we didn't understand it and we voted yes. And that's one of the tactics they're using. And a question that I had posed to me is, if you have a county that they don't opt out, but one of the municipalities opt out, and they pass a flossed, can they still do that? Can the county participate in that, and the city that opts out does not get to participate in it? What's some of the clarification on that, on who opts out and who gets to participate in the flossed?
Right. So the flossed, set the flossed aside. It is a separate issue that ended up being on this bill to make it a package deal for property owners' tax relief. It has nothing to do with the floating homestead exemption as far as how it would be implemented by the county or the city. But it does require that the cities all participate and agree on the flossed. The schools are not participating in the flossed, but it's a floating local option sales tax that is intended to lower the millage rate. For every dollar they receive in that sales tax revenue, they would be forced to lower their millage rates by that same dollar amount. So if they collect $20 million a year with a sales tax currently, then if you added the extra 1%, which we call floss, then the millage rates for those cities and those counties would have to be lowered the exact same dollar amount, dollar for dollar. What that means in some situations, like even in Fannin County, where you have one of the lowest millage rates in the state, you could essentially eliminate property taxes for the Fannin County homeowners if they were to pass this floss tax. So that is very attractive to a lot of homeowners that have a fixed income, a senior citizen, and what have you. And it's only the people who are spending the money in the community that are at that point paying, which includes all your tourists and all your visitors that come in and out of the community throughout the year. So that may be something that would be attractive to Fannin County and the cities of Blue Ridge and McKaysville. So I would encourage them to take a real sharp look at that, but it does not help the school board whatsoever.
Okay, so why not the school board? What was the reason the school board can't participate in that? And they actually, I'll just say this: I was in a meeting, and not to quote anyone at the school board or the superintendent of schools, but they're immediately, the local publication starts writing at that they got to start cutting programs, and they would have to, maybe lay people off, and just, I call it the scare tactics. Why
Right.
can't the school participate in it? What was the reasoning for that?
I don't know the background and why they allowed it just for the cities and the counties. I think the cities and the counties were the ones who advocated for it the most. But remember, this is not a way to generate extra revenue. So even the cities and counties aren't going to come out with more money if they pass the floss. It's a substitute for one revenue source for another. So you take 10 million out of the ad valorem tax category and 10 million back in from sales tax. So it's a zero sum game. You're not going to get an additional penny for passing the floss. It's just a way to help reduce the burden of somebody owning a home and having to pay the government to live in their own home. And if you don't pay that tax, guess what happens? The government comes and takes it away. The only source of revenue that a school board has to generate for their operations is the ad valorem tax. I would love to see us find an alternative to that, but I didn't see that opportunity in this bill, because that would require an additional constitutional amendment to allow the school boards to levy sales tax for something other than capital goods. If you remember, the SPLOS that the schools collect today are only allowed to use that money for capital projects and expenditures. There's a few exceptions for technology and books and so forth, but it cannot be used for daily operating expenses. So that's the main reason why schools are not included in those floss and loss negotiations.
Would anything altering HB581, would it cause us to have to vote again to amend the Constitution, or can they amend this without going through the voters?
House Bill 581 can be amended as many times as the Georgia General Assembly desires. The constitutional portion of it cannot be amended by general law. It has to be amended by another vote of the taxpayers, if that makes sense. So anything that was in the constitutional
it didn't.
amendment.
What separates those two? It didn't to me. What separates those two?
Okay. Well, the constitutional amendment was passed under a different law. That was 1021, I believe. It was House Resolution 1021. So if you pull up House Resolution 1021, there's the provisions of changing the Constitution are clearly identified and delineated what that constitutional amendment does. House Bill 581 is what we call the enabling legislation for the how to carry out that process. It's sort of like a homeowners association that has covenants and bylaws, and then you have rules and regulations. The covenants and bylaws can only be changed by like a 2/3 vote of the homeowners, but the rules and regulations can be changed by a majority vote of the HOA, correct? Same thing at the General
Yeah.
Assembly.
So,
It takes 50% of the House and Senate to pass a general bill, but it takes 2/3 of the House and Senate to pass a constitutional amendment. So the meat and the potatoes of all this stuff is in House Bill 581. To change the Constitution, that was done in House Resolution 1021.
so 1021 changed the Constitution, and when you change the Constitution, you have to have a bill that activates it. If
That's correct.
581
It's
activated the change.
that's right. This
So,
basically
so,
it's a mechanism of carrying out the changes in the constitutional amendment.
so what's to protect people in Georgia from 581 not getting altered in a negative way instead of, I mean, I guess there's no protection there whatsoever that
Well,
581 cannot be
the
altered in a negative way?
it could be changed, it could be repealed. A lot of things can happen. The constitutional amendment is the one that protects the homeowners on these fast, rapid increases in value. So
Okay.
that's documented now in the Constitution. That part cannot be changed unless it goes back to the voters for for a vote. House Bill 581 is just basically the mechanism of how do we implement it and how do we lay it out and move it moving forward. And that's where the opt-out version came, which in my opinion should not have been put in the bill, but it can be altered, and it's possible it could be this year, but it'll have to be done quickly because all of your local governments have to get their tax digest approved quickly. They have to get their budgets adopted in order to get the millage rate set by midsummer to get the tax bills out by fall, which are usually paid sometime between November and January 1st.
Okay, is there anything going on in legislation now under the Gold Dome this year that would alter 581? Is there anything happening right now as we speak?
The only discussions that I'm aware of, Brian, are over in the House. There's discussion, and there may be a bill. I think Representative Chastain may know more about this. I've heard there's a bill in the House that would extend the opt-out deadline by 1 or 2 months. That's, in my opinion, is a little troubling. I do not want to give more opportunities for local governments to opt out of this provision. This bill was intended to help homeowners. It will help homeowners. I do not believe it'll have a negative impact to the local governments at all. A lot of the cities and counties are staying in. They're not opting out. We have some school boards now that are going to stay in as well. Pickens County, I was told yesterday, is not going to opt out. Union County is not going to opt out. Lumpkin County has had their second hearing. They have a lot of opposition to the school boards opting out. I hope after the third hearing they have next week, the school board will decide not to opt out as well. This is good for the property owners, good for the homeowners, and it will not hinder school boards from doing their jobs, in my opinion.
All right. What is there anything that we did not cover this morning that is coming up as far as questions that you're getting, or things that we need to make sure the citizens are aware? Because I will tell you this, when you go to a town hall meeting, and I say this in all due respect of your counties and your cities and the Board of Education, but a lot of people are saying things that make it very confusing if you're sitting in the room. And I don't think it's that hard, because they keep talking about home rule, exemptions, having to raise taxes, the millage rate. And then there's the what services do you want us to cut? What would you want to close with this morning as far as maybe helping clear some things up?
First of all, I would encourage your listeners to go to these hearings. Don't sit at home and complain about it after the fact. It's important that you get off the couch, go to these hearings, listen to what's being told, ask questions, and then express your opinions loudly to these local government officials. They need to hear from the citizens, because if people don't show up, they're going to say, well, nobody came to the meetings, no one's complaining, or what have you. Furthermore, I would say look at the revenues that they have collected over the last 5 to 10 years and answer this question. Why do they want to keep raising the revenues with tax increases off of values and not raising the millage rate? It's because of the accountability of it. They do not want to take the pressure from the taxpayers for voting to increase the millage rate. The same thing would happen if we were downtown Atlanta today, increasing the income tax rate from 5.2 to 5.5. You and your people would be raising hell with us for raising taxes. Instead, we're down there this week lowering the income tax rate by 20 basis points. We're lowering it for the third year in a row, putting that money back in the taxpayers' pockets because that's money that's coming in that is a surplus to the general fund and to the state budget. And so we're sending that money back. We're not putting more money into state government and creating a bigger bureaucracy. Look and see what local governments have done with their money and ask the question, why do you keep raising revenues 15, 20, 30% year after year? And that is what's going on. And I wish Chuck Hufstetler were on here today to tell you what's happening in his district, because it's worse than it is in North Georgia. It is a lot worse in Rome than it is up in Dahlonega or Ellijay or Blue Ridge or Blairsville and some of the other parts of my district. So if you listen to other people in the state, you're going to find that this is being abused, and it's a backdoor tax increase as a way for local governments not to have to raise the millage rate. And if they need more money, they need to be able to stand up in front of the taxpayers and explain why. That's plain and simple. So people need to get up, go to the school board meetings, go to the town hall meetings with the cities and the counties, ask questions, and I think you'll see that they're raising a lot of revenues off of these increases on homeowner values, and that is pushing people to a point where they can no longer afford to live in their home.
So this basically curtails increased revenue based on assessment. That
Correct.
no longer be the case. And hearing, and I don't want to identify a certain county because that's not fair to any other county, because every county is not alike. Or I'll say it like this, not every county's been a good steward of taxpayers' money, but we'll leave that out there for you out there to decide. The point is, instead of the assessments raising the revenue that's coming into the county or Board of Education or the city, they just have to say, we want more money, we're going to raise your taxes, and here's why.
That's it.
And
total transparency.
And that's pretty much it. Total transfer.
And let me remind you one more thing, if I can, and I have some more time if you want to keep talking. People who move to these communities, businesses that come here and build buildings, whether it's hospitals or restaurants or hotels, there's new growth in the digest from all of that construction. This does not prevent counties from collecting new monies from that new growth. So if you have 400 or 500 new homes a year being built in your hometown, or in some counties there's thousands of new homes being built, all that's new money to the local governments. This bill does not stop that one bit from coming in, and they'll continue to collect all of that new money from all their new growth. In fact, if you sell a home that's on the books for $200,000, if a $200,000 house sells for $400,000, as soon as that sale hits the books, the tax assessor will reassess that house basically for the sales price of $400,000, and the school and the city and the county will then start collecting that local millage rate against the new price of which that new owner paid for that house. And so when we lock in these assessments at a lower rate, that's only as long as the person who owns the house keeps it. As soon as they sell it, or if they modify it and renovate it or add on to it, the tax assessor is going to reassess it, and then the counties and the cities and the local schools will then be able to collect a new tax on that new value based on the sales price or the value at that point. So this is not as big of an impact on them as they're letting everybody know. They are, maybe they're a little unsure themselves as to what the impact's going to be, but this is going to limit the amount of growth in the increase of the values to not exceed the year of prior year's CPI. Last year that was 6% or 7%. 2 years ago it was 8%, and the previous year I think was 10%. So surely they can live within their means if they can live with a 10% increase in their revenue. I know I have to do that at my house, and I think everybody else that's listening does the same thing. We're all on fixed incomes to some point, and we believe the government should live on a fixed income as well. And if they can't, they need to go on a diet and cut their spending.
All right. So the other night when I was at a meeting, exemptions started coming up. Several counties, and not every county it has the same exemption. So let me just say out there before I ask this question, I don't know what exemptions your county has in place, but the other night at a meeting, a list of exemptions came up that they already have in place in the counties. And it got very confusing on, would this alter any of the exemptions? And then the other question is, would there ever be a time where HB581 would take precedence over the exemption? Or could the state say, your exemptions are no longer valid? I mean, I will tell you, that's what continued to come up, got very convoluted, and I think confusing at a lot of these meetings.
So, real quick answer is it will not impact any current exemption, period. If, let's say, Forsyth County has a 4% assessment freeze, in other words, they can't increase the assessments more than 4%, but the CPI for last year was only 1% or 2%, then whichever one is better for the homeowner would take precedent, to answer your question. So in this scenario, if you had a 2% CPI last year, but a local legislation was at 4%, then the state's 2% freeze cap would take effect and take precedent over the 4%. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So whichever
And
benefits the taxpayer the most is the one that you go with. The local tax assessor's offices have the technology and the equipment and the software to manage all of this. It is not a logistical issue at all. I've heard that being thrown up as well, that they're saying that the local tax assessor's office can't handle this. That's not true. They already handle it. They're doing it now with 15 or 20 different categories of tax parcels and tax values.
so this wouldn't alter any of your tax exemptions in your county. And the best exemption, whether it be the state or the county, is what would benefit the taxpayer that year.
Whichever one is beneficial, most advantageous to the homeowner is the one that would take precedent. That's right.
If the state is 2% and the county's 4%, 2% will be activated. If the CPI is 6 and the county's 4, then the 4% would be activated.
That's right. And remember, if it's a 6% CPI, the tax assessors could still go up to 6%. They just can't go above 6%. If they go above 6%, then your exemption increases by that amount. And so that's all this bill does. I do believe the school boards, some of them are confused. They're not clear on what the law is and how this is going to be implemented. And I'm telling you, this is good for the homeowners. It does not pull the rug out from under the local governments like they're telling people.
Okay. I don't know. A lot of people are opting out, having meetings to opt out. There's a lot of confusion in the room. I'm just trying to ask the questions, go around the circle to ask the questions, to get as many answers as possible. Because first of all, I want to see the property tax, the people that own the property, that pay the tax, get some relief as far as these assessments. And I know that firsthand. The floss, I want one more thing, and I know you have time, but I have some other things I've got to get done this morning. But the floss, I want to go back to that for a minute. That's not a revenue increase to the county. That's an offset. That's an offset of property tax.
It's a swap. You're taking it. You're taking it from one bucket, putting it in another bucket, dollar for dollar. There's no increase, zero net gain for the county or the city.
Okay, so what I heard the other night was, well, if we do this, we will start losing revenue. They're going to bring in the same amount of revenue they did last year, and without doing
Correct.
anything, they'll bring in
That's
the same
correct.
revenue. And then what I heard was, well, if we pass a flossed, we got to get it on a ballot. It even went this far. We got to get it on a ballot. An election costs $40,000. So we're going to have the taxpayers have to pay $40,000 to put this on the ballot. It was a scare tactic to me. And then we're not guaranteed it'll pass. And the earliest we would see the offset is like 2026. But I think those two are getting confused. This doesn't mean you have to pass that tax.
No, and listen, you just said something that almost makes me laugh, but also cry. They're worried about spending $40,000 for a special election for the floss. Why aren't they worried about spending $40,000 for a special election for their lost when they can wait until the general election or the primary the next year and it won't cost them anything? They purposely put these special sales tax elections on a special election date in March when no one else is going to come vote except for the people who are in favor of it. Very few people come out and vote for a special election, but they're willing to pay $40,000 for that purpose. But they throw this up at you saying they don't want to pay $40,000 for the floss. I don't think they should have a special election ever for a sales tax, period. It should be done on a primary election date or a general election date, and only those two times. That way it doesn't cost the taxpayer additional money.
All I could say is you said it.
Well, I'll bet you feel the same way. I'll bet you feel the same way.
I have said for years, if you support a SPLOST, if you support eSPLOST, if you support any of these penny taxes, okay, but put it on the general election when the majority of the people come out and you get the majority of the voters to make that decision on if they want that tax. But they have it in off years and they have a special election and they pay for that. You said it. I guess I'm going to go as far as say thank you. The other night I'm sitting there and I don't want to. Now this may shock you, but I didn't want to be controversial. All right, so I'm sitting there and I didn't want to. No. I'm serious. I was trying to have an open discussion, and I appreciate where I live. We had an open discussion. I appreciate the chairman that facilitated it. It was a good open discussion. They allowed people to say what they wanted for as long as they wanted. The meeting went 2 hours. So my respect for that. But it was said that this would be a special election and would cost the county $40,000. Where someone in the room, because there's a recording out there, it's on tape, someone in the room stood up and said, why would we want to do something and spend $40,000 for a special election? And I'm sitting there and I'm saying, don't get up. Don't say anything. Don't get up. Don't say anything. Because I was just about ready to say, boy, I tell you what, if it was a SPLOST, we wouldn't have no problem getting that election on the ballot.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
no more special elections. If I were a school board member, I would never vote for a special election for something that you can do next spring when there's going to be a primary election for Republicans and Democrats running for statewide offices all the way down to local county commissioners. And then in the November election, there's a general election when 60% of the voters will come out and vote for it. If you have a good project that people want, they'll vote for it. I'm convinced of that. We don't need special elections for sales taxes.
Okay, so wait a minute. Now, I didn't say this. You got it? I did not say this. You did. So maybe we could get some legislation saying all tax votes have to be on a general election. Maybe something like that could happen.
We passed that bill 2 years ago on the T-splost. That's why you're not seeing it like you were before. But I'll have to go back and look and see what else was under that provision. There's some sales taxes cannot be passed except where there's a primary or a general election. But this should be an amendment to a bill that restricts the e-loss and the loss from being done on a special election. And I agree 100%.
So the
But that takes
floss
away their
does
local
not.
control that they fuss about. There's your local control argument again. But uh, it's just it's nonsense, Brian, and it's a waste of taxpayers' money, and it needs to stop.
So the floss would be an offset, but the one
Yes.
argument that I heard is if you pass a floss, the you know the all citizens would pay it, and it hurts the lowest economic run of the ladder in your county, that it's actually an increase to them. So a little bit of an
Well,
argument there.
I,
Go ahead.
yeah, but listen, we don't have sales tax on groceries. So if you're on a fixed income, minimum wage job, or you're on Social Security, you're not spending a lot of money because you're not making a lot of money. And so I hear the argument for a regressive tax, whatever, but I don't believe it impacts the poor people as much as some of these people would argue that it does. It's the people who are spending the big money on big ticket items that would be paying the lion's share of that. But it also, remember, you hear this from the Chamber of Commerce every time we do a sales tax. 50 or 60% of your income from sales tax come from where? Outside the county. Fannin County is maybe even higher than that because the population in Fannin County doubles or triples in the months of June, July, and August, right? From a lot of people that live here in the summer and go back to Florida in the wintertime. And so there's a good argument for the floss, but I think it has to be done in a general election or a primary election to be fair to where every citizen has a right to come out and vote that will come out and participate. I know people have a right to vote in a special election, but they tend not to. Just look at historical trends. You may get 5 to 10% voter turnout for a special called election when the only thing on the ballot is a sales tax extension.
Well, um, I never hear them discussing budget adjustments that may be in the area of cutting something. That's something they when I say there's a lot of counties, so that's not a direction at any particular county, city, or board of education. But
Right.
every time I bring up looking at the budget, I have it's been said to me before, what services do you want to cut? And that's the first thing I always hear. What
Cut,
services do you want to cut?
cut the ones you don't use. That's the obvious answer. But another reason the schools rely heavily and primarily on ad valorem taxes is because it's a consistent revenue stream to where sales taxes can float up and down based on the economic indicators. So if you have a recession or a heavy recession near a depression like we had in 2010, 8, 9, and 10, state government and local governments had to make major cuts to their spending while the school boards maintain a pretty healthy revenue line because they were levying property tax across the board and it doesn't fluctuate up and down. Does that make sense? So that's the argument for not having the sales tax to fund your schools.
All right, Senator, I have to go, but I want to invite you back. I know you're busy first of the week. We're talking about the budget in Georgia, and President Trump has done a lot of things. Can you clear something up, change directions a minute? This past week, these are federal government executive orders he is signing, not state. But do we have any state agencies at all, regardless if it's the state, counties, whatever, that have state funded DEI programs? Do we have any in the state?
Oh, I believe they're baked into the systems. I know the Board of Regents has taken a strong look at that because we were bringing legislation last year to prohibit DEI programs from being implemented at the universities. So Chancellor Perdue passed resolutions by the Board of Regents in the fall that would prohibit and rip out any DEI programs and quotas or any kind of goals whatsoever with in reference to DEI. And I believe they did that before the legislative session started because they knew we were going to bring legislation this year to do it if they did not. Now, other state agencies I'm not aware of, but I'm told that the governor's office is working on that as well to make sure that does
Okay.
not occur. And so I support what President Trump did this week. What an amazing week we've had from the day of the inauguration up through last night. The man's working day and night. I don't know how he gets on um, with the track that he's on. He is doing phenomenal work already this week. And I know the court challenges are already popping up here and there. So we're just going to have to keep fighting the establishment, fighting the systems, and some of these bureaucrats that'll just continue to fight till their last breath to try to defeat Trump in his attempt to turn this country around. So it's been a great week, and I know you've been excited as well. And I couldn't take my eyes off of the inauguration on Monday. That was just a beautiful ceremony up there in Washington.
Yes, I know these questions are, and I say respectfully, these questions are really something that we would direct to the governor's office. But one more is, people have to go back to work. If you're in the federal government, any of these agencies, and you were doing remote work from home, you got to go back to work. If you don't go back to work, you're out. Do we have any state agencies where we have remote workers that need to go back to work that you're aware of? And I know that question's probably better directed at the governor's office, but is there anything like that in Georgia that you're aware of?
So, yeah, I think what we saw when COVID hit and the state was literally shut down for weeks, if not months, a lot of the state agencies did not come back to work. In fact, I can give you an example here in Dahlonega where I live. The DFACS office remained closed. The doors were locked, and there was a sign on the front door that told people if you needed assistance to call this 800 number and set an appointment. Well, I called the 800 number because I didn't believe what I was hearing from a constituent. I drove up to the DFACS office, got on the phone, I called the 800 number, and I said, "Can you let me in?" And they said, "Where are you?" I said, "I'm in Dahlonega." And they said, "Well, you'll need to make an appointment." I said, "So I can't just walk in the door?" And their answer was, "Well, there's no one there. They work from home and they'll just have to arrange a time to come and meet you." Well, I called the governor's office then. I said, "It's time to put people back to work because constituents of mine are trying to get help out of their DFACS office here locally, and they can't get a response from the local people who work in these offices." And so it wasn't long after that we saw that change and people started coming back to work. And I think the governor's done a good job of making sure that a lot of these people that were working from home weren't being held accountable or no longer working for the state. And I'll give you one example. There was a person working for the EPD or DNR over at the Floyd Towers, which is a big office building next door to the Capitol. They had moved to New York, Brian. They were living out of state, still on the state payroll, pulling a full-time salary, and they were working another job in New York at the same time they were supposed to be working from home on the state's payroll. No one knew that they had moved to New York and they were no longer in Georgia. So that's how bad this system is in place. This stay at home and work from home does not work for government, in my opinion, because there's no accountability. So I applaud President Trump and his staff for doing what they're doing to make sure that everybody that's on a state or federal payroll shows up for work at 8 o'clock every morning and works from their office.
Senator, I appreciate you taking the questions, and I appreciate you taking the time. We'll get back with you next week. We know. I'd like to talk to you about some of the legislation at least on the Senate side that you could talk about, and the budget. You guys are right now, this week and next week, is it budget hearings and discussions in committee? Is that what's going on right now?
Yes, sir. The budget hearings were canceled earlier in the week because of the snow in South Georgia and Middle Georgia. The governor has already put forth his budget proposals for the year. There's some positive things that we can talk about. I'd love to come back on next week, spend some time going over that. But we have billions of dollars that are being returned back to the taxpayers. We're also investing billions into infrastructure for freight and logistics, also water and sewer projects around the state. We're lowering the income tax rate and a lot of other good things that are going on in that budget. So if you have time for me in the next week to 2 weeks, I'll be happy to come back and talk more about it.
Appreciate it, Senator. You have a nice day, and thank you for taking time to come in and answer our questions. We appreciate it. Have a nice day, sir.
Thank you. Anytime. Bye-bye.
All right, folks. Ran a little long there. I don't know what happened with the other state senator. We will check. I would like to get him in to talk about Floyd County. I don't know. Maybe he had a technical problem trying to get in our system. We'll check on that. Before we, now we're going to come back. I'm going to still work on part one of the Georgia GOP. We're going to do that. We're going to work on that, part one. And will this 2026 be the year that Democrats make gains under the Gold Dome? We're going to discuss that. But before we go to break, we want to support our local Fannin County Animal Shelter. Diane, let's do that. Look at that beautiful pooch from the Fannin County Animal Shelter. When we return, part one, we will start today on the Georgia GOP, Republicans in Georgia, and are we ready for 2026 after these messages?